I found a positive pregnancy test in our bathroom trash, but I had a vasectomy 4 years ago. I didn't confront her. I waited until her baby shower, stood in front of 40 guests, and asked one simple question that destroyed everything. My name is Owen Mercer, and I work as a fire inspector for the city's central district, which means I spend most of my days walking through buildings looking for code violations and reconstructing incident timelines when things go wrong, and the skills I developed doing that work turned out to be exactly what I needed when I discovered that my wife was pregnant with another man's child and had been planning to pass it off as mine for the rest of our lives. I've been married to Claire for 7 years, and for most of that time I thought we had a solid relationship built on mutual respect and honest communication, but it turns out I was living in a carefully constructed illusion that she'd been maintaining while conducting a secret life that I knew absolutely nothing about until I made a routine discovery on an ordinary Tuesday morning that changed everything. I woke up at 6:30 that morning, like I always do because my shift starts at 8, and I like to have time to make coffee and read the news before heading to the station, and Claire was still asleep because she works in marketing and doesn't usually leave for her office until around 9, so I went through my normal routine of showering and getting dressed and making breakfast without disturbing her. I was taking out the bathroom trash because it was getting full, and I'm particular about keeping things clean and organized, which is probably a habit I developed from years of inspecting buildings and looking for things that are out of place or don't match the patterns they're supposed to follow. And as I lifted the white plastic bag out of the small trash can beside the sink, I saw something pink near the top that caught my attention because it didn't look like the usual collection of cotton balls and empty bottles that we typically throw away. I set the bag down on the bathroom floor and opened it carefully to get a better look at what had caught my eye, and that's when I saw the pregnancy test sitting right on top of everything else with 2 clear pink lines in the result window indicating a positive result. And my first reaction was confusion rather than excitement, because Claire and I had discussed having children several times over the years and had agreed to wait until we were more financially stable and had paid down more of our mortgage before starting a family. My second reaction, which came about 3 seconds after the first, was a cold realization that swept through my body like ice water, because I remembered very clearly that I'd had a vasectomy 4 years ago after we'd decided that we probably didn't want biological children at all and might consider adoption someday if we changed our minds about parenthood. I stood there in the bathroom holding the trash bag and staring at the pregnancy test for probably a full minute while my brain processed what I was looking at and tried to figure out how this could possibly make sense. And the only logical explanations were either that the test was wrong, which seemed unlikely given that home pregnancy tests are generally quite accurate, or that Claire was pregnant with someone else's child, which seemed impossible because I trusted her completely and had never had any reason to suspect that she was being unfaithful or dishonest with me about anything significant. I carefully pulled the pregnancy test out of the trash bag and set it on the bathroom counter, and then I went to the kitchen and got my phone and came back and took several photographs of the test from different angles, making sure that the date on that morning's newspaper was visible in the frame so there would be a clear timestamp proving when the photos were taken. After I finished documenting the pregnancy test, I put it back in the trash bag exactly where I'd found it and tied the bag closed and took it out to the garbage bin in the alley behind our apartment building. And then I came back inside and sat down at my desk in the small home office we use for paying bills and storing paperwork and tried to think through what I should do next. The rational part of my brain that I use for fire inspections and incident reconstructions told me that I needed more information before jumping to conclusions or confronting Claire with accusations that might turn out to be wrong, so I opened my laptop and logged into the patient portal for the medical clinic where I'd had my vasectomy procedure done 4 years earlier, and I navigated through the menu options until I found my procedure records and pulled up the file that documented the surgery. The vasectomy record was very clear and contained all the details I remembered from that day, including the date of the procedure, the name of the surgeon who'd performed it, the notes about the post-operative follow-up appointment where they'd confirmed that the procedure had been successful, and the final clearance documentation stating that I could resume normal activities and that the vasectomy had achieved its intended result of permanent sterilization. I downloaded the entire record as a PDF file and saved it to a new folder on my laptop that I labeled simply Documentation because I had a feeling I was going to need to organize quite a bit of evidence before the situation resolved itself one way or another, and I made sure to note the exact date of the procedure, which had been almost exactly 4 years ago in early spring. I sat at my desk for another 20 minutes just staring at the vasectomy documentation and trying to figure out if there was any possibility that the procedure could have failed or reversed itself spontaneously, because I'd read articles about how vasectomies occasionally fail and men end up fertile again even after the surgery has been completed and cleared, but when I searched online for information about vasectomy failure rates, I learned that spontaneous reversal is extremely rare and almost always happens within the first few months after the procedure rather than years later. The medical literature suggested that the failure rate for vasectomies after the first year is less than 1 in 2,000, and even in those rare cases, the failure is usually detected during follow-up testing rather than discovered years later through an unexpected pregnancy. So the chances that my vasectomy had spontaneously failed after 4 years without any symptoms or warning signs seemed astronomically small. I closed my laptop and got ready to leave for work, and as I was walking out of the apartment, I heard Claire starting to stir in the bedroom. But I didn't go in to say goodbye like I usually do because I didn't trust myself to act normal around her when my mind was racing with questions about the pregnancy test and what it meant for our marriage. I drove to the fire station where I'm based and went through the motions of my morning briefing with the other inspectors, but I was barely paying attention to what my supervisor was saying about the day's schedule because I kept thinking about that pink pregnancy test in the bathroom trash and trying to figure out what Claire's plan could possibly be if she was actually pregnant with another man's child. The most obvious explanation was that she was having an affair and had gotten pregnant by her lover, and she was either planning to tell me the baby was mine because she assumed I wouldn't question it or didn't know about my vasectomy, or she was planning to confess everything and ask for a divorce before the pregnancy became obvious. The second explanation seemed more likely because Claire knew perfectly well that I'd had a vasectomy since she'd driven me to the clinic for the procedure and picked me up afterward, so she couldn't reasonably expect me to believe the baby was mine unless she thought I'd somehow forgotten about having had the surgery, which seemed unlikely given that it was a fairly significant medical procedure that we'd discussed extensively before I went through with it. I spent most of that first day at work trying to focus on my inspections while also thinking about how to gather more information about Claire's pregnancy and the circumstances surrounding it, and I realized that I needed to be very careful about how I approached the situation, because if I confronted her directly without solid evidence, she could deny everything or come up with some explanation that I wouldn't be able to verify. And then I'd be stuck in a situation where I knew something was wrong but couldn't prove it. My training as a fire inspector had taught me that the best way to understand what really happened in any situation is to gather all the available evidence first and then reconstruct the timeline based on facts rather than assumptions or emotional reactions. So I decided to treat this like an investigation and document everything I could find before making any decisions about what to do. When I got home that evening around 6:30, Claire was in the kitchen making dinner, and she seemed completely normal and cheerful as she asked me about my day and told me about a meeting she'd had at work with some potential new clients, and I played along and acted like everything was fine, even though I felt like I was watching a stranger perform a role rather than talking to the woman I'd been married to for 7 years. We ate dinner together and watched television for a while, and around 9 o'clock, Claire mentioned that she'd been feeling unusually tired lately and wondered if she might be coming down with something, and I asked her if she wanted me to pick up any medicine or vitamins for her, but she said no, she was sure it would pass on its own. That comment about feeling tired struck me as significant because fatigue is one of the early symptoms of pregnancy, and it suggested that Claire was already experiencing the physical effects of being pregnant, even though she hadn't officially told me about it yet, which meant she was probably waiting for the right moment to make some kind of announcement or possibly working up the courage to confess that the baby wasn't mine. I went to bed that night lying next to my wife and thinking about how strange it felt to know something so important about her life that she didn't realize I knew, and I wondered how long she'd been planning to keep this secret and what her endgame was supposed to be. Over the next 2 days, I went through my normal routine of going to work and coming home and having dinner with Claire, and I paid close attention to everything she said and did, looking for any clues that might help me understand what was happening. But she seemed completely normal and gave no indication that anything unusual was going on in her life. On Thursday evening, while she was in the shower, I noticed her phone light up on the bedside table with a text message notification, and I glanced at the screen just out of habit and saw a preview of a message from someone named Derek that read, "Can't wait to meet him or her," followed by a heart emoji, and that was the moment when I knew for certain that my wife was not only pregnant, but was sharing that news with someone else before she'd shared it with me. I picked up my own phone and quickly took a photograph of Claire's phone screen showing the notification preview with the timestamp visible, and then I set her phone back down exactly where it had been and walked out of the bedroom before she finished her shower and came back to find me standing there. 3 days after finding the pregnancy test in our bathroom trash, I was sitting on the couch with Claire listening to her tell me that she was pregnant, and I had to work very hard to keep my face neutral and my voice calm because I already knew what she was about to say, and I'd spent those 3 days preparing myself emotionally for this moment while also gathering additional evidence that would help me understand the full scope of what had been happening behind my back. She had her hands folded in her lap and was looking at me with an expression that seemed like a mixture of excitement and nervousness. And she started by saying that she had some news that she hoped would make me happy, even though she knew we hadn't been planning to start a family right away. And then she paused for a moment before telling me that she'd taken a pregnancy test earlier that week, and it had come back positive. I let a few seconds of silence hang in the air after she finished speaking because I wanted to see how she would react to my lack of immediate response, and she started filling the quiet space with additional explanations about how surprised she'd been when she realized her period was late, and how she'd bought the test just to be sure and hadn't expected it to actually be positive. I asked her how far along she thought she was, and she said the test didn't tell her that, but based on her cycle, she estimated she was probably about 6 weeks pregnant, which would put the conception date sometime in mid-February, according to the mental calculation I did while sitting there pretending to process this information for the first time. The problem with her timeline was that I'd been home every single night in February because it had been a slow month at work with no major inspections requiring overnight travel or extended shifts, and Claire and I had barely been intimate during that time because she'd claimed she was stressed about a big project at her marketing firm and wasn't feeling particularly romantic, which at the time I'd accepted without question because everyone goes through periods of lower libido when work is demanding. Now that I thought back on those weeks with the clarity that comes from knowing someone has been lying to you, I realized that her lack of interest in physical intimacy with me had probably been because she was already involved with someone else and was getting her needs met elsewhere, and the pregnancy was just the inevitable result of that other relationship progressing to a point where contraception had either failed or been abandoned entirely. I stood up from the couch and walked over to where Claire was sitting and wrapped my arms around her and told her that I was happy about the news and that we would figure everything out together. And I felt her body relax against mine as she hugged me back and said she'd been so worried about how I would react because she knew this wasn't what we'd planned. She started crying a little bit and said she knew the timing wasn't perfect, but that maybe this was the universe telling us we were ready to be parents even if we didn't think we were. And I made appropriate supportive noises while my mind was racing through all the implications of what she'd just told me and how I was going to use this information to expose the truth about what had really been happening. After Claire went to bed that night, I sat in my home office and opened a new document on my laptop where I started building a detailed timeline of everything I knew so far, beginning with the date I'd found the pregnancy test and working backward to try to establish when the affair had likely started and who the other man was. The text message preview I'd photographed from Claire's phone had come from someone named Derek, and the message about being excited to meet him or her strongly suggested that Derek knew about the pregnancy and was anticipating being involved in the child's life in some capacity, which meant Claire had told him about the baby before telling me, her husband. I opened Claire's social media profiles on my laptop and started going through her recent posts and tagged photos looking for any mention of someone named Derek, and it didn't take long before I found what I was looking for because Claire wasn't particularly careful about maintaining separate spheres for different parts of her life. About 6 months ago, she'd been tagged in several photos from what appeared to be an industry networking event for marketing professionals, and in 3 of those photos she was standing next to or talking to a man whose profile identified him as Derek Ashford. And when I clicked through to his profile, I saw that he was listed as the chief operating officer of a technology firm called Vertex Solutions that specialized in digital marketing platforms for enterprise clients. What made Derek's profile particularly interesting was that it showed he had significant influence in the local business community, sitting on the boards of several professional organizations and frequently posting about leadership development and corporate culture, and his company Vertex Solutions was exactly the kind of place where someone like Claire would want to work if she was looking to advance her career beyond her current position at a mid-size marketing firm. I took screenshots of Derek's profile and the photos where he and Claire appeared together, making sure to capture the dates and locations that were tagged in each post, and I saved everything to my growing documentation folder with careful attention to organizing the files in a way that would make it easy to present them as evidence later if that became necessary. The next morning, I woke up before Claire and spent some time looking through our shared cloud photo storage account, which we'd set up years ago as a way to automatically back up all the photos from both of our phones so we'd never lose important memories, even if one of our devices got lost or damaged. I filtered the photos by date and started scrolling through the images from the past 6 months looking for anything that might give me additional information about Claire's relationship with Derek. And after about 20 minutes of searching, I found something that made my stomach drop, even though I'd already suspected that what I was looking for would eventually turn up. There was an ultrasound image in the recently deleted folder that had been removed from the main album just 3 days ago, and when I clicked on it to see the full resolution version, I could see it was a standard early pregnancy ultrasound with the characteristic grainy black and white image showing what looked like a small bean-shaped form in the center of the frame. What made this image significant wasn't the ultrasound itself, but rather the metadata that was attached to it, which I could view by clicking on the information icon, and that metadata showed that the photo had been taken by Claire's phone 2 weeks earlier and had been tagged with a location that corresponded to a women's health clinic on the other side of the city from where we lived. More importantly, when I looked at the tags that had been applied to the photo, I saw that Claire had manually added a tag for someone identified as Derek A, before apparently thinking better of it and deleting the entire photo from the shared album, probably hoping that I would never notice it had been there in the first place. I took several screenshots of the photo metadata showing the date it was taken, the location where it was captured, the tag that had been applied, and the date it had been deleted, and then I did something that I knew would give me additional leverage later by restoring the photo to the main album and then immediately deleting it again, which would create a new entry in the activity log showing that I'd accessed this file and demonstrating that I had legitimate access to our shared storage account. Later that morning, after Claire had left for work, I called the women's health clinic whose address had appeared in the ultrasound photo metadata, and I told the receptionist who answered that I was Owen Mercer and I was calling to confirm an appointment for my wife Claire, and the receptionist asked me to hold for a moment while she pulled up the file. When she came back on the line, she said she was looking at the account now and could I confirm which appointment I was asking about. And I said I just wanted to make sure I had the right date and time for the next visit, and she said that according to the file, the next appointment was scheduled for the following week on Tuesday afternoon at 2:30. I thanked her for confirming that information and was about to hang up when she said something that made me freeze with the phone still pressed against my ear, which was that she wanted to make sure we had both names spelled correctly in the system for the joint parental records that had been requested when the account was set up. I asked her what she meant by both names, trying to keep my voice steady and casual, and she said that the file showed Claire Mercer and Derek Ashford as the two names listed on the account for purposes of receiving appointment updates and medical information, and she asked if I wanted to be added to that list as well, or if there had been some kind of mistake in how the account was configured. I told her that no, there was no mistake, and everything was set up correctly, and I thanked her again and ended the call before she could ask any follow-up questions that might have revealed that I wasn't actually aware of how the account had been structured. I sat in my car in the fire station parking lot for several minutes after that phone call, just staring at the steering wheel and trying to process what I'd just learned, which was that Claire and Derek had jointly set up parental records at a medical clinic as if they were a couple preparing to have a child together, and Claire had done this while still living with me and maintaining the fiction that we had a normal marriage with no secrets or betrayals. I pulled out my phone and opened my notes app and typed out a detailed summary of the conversation I'd just had with the clinic receptionist, making sure to include the exact wording she'd used when she mentioned the joint parental records and the fact that both Claire's and Derek's names were listed as recipients of medical information. I also noted the date and time of the call and the phone number for the clinic so that if I ever needed to verify this information later, I would have a clear record of where it had come from and when I'd obtained it, and I saved the note with a timestamp so there would be no question about when I'd learned this particular piece of information. That evening, when I got home from work, Claire was in the kitchen making dinner, and she seemed to be in an unusually good mood, humming along to music that was playing from her phone and occasionally doing a little dance step as she moved between the counter and the stove. I asked her how her day had been, and she said it had been great because she'd had a really productive meeting with a potential new client who was very interested in hiring her firm for a major campaign, and she said the client had specifically asked for her by name because they'd heard good things about her work from someone in their professional network. I asked her who had recommended her, and she hesitated for just a fraction of a second before saying it was someone named Derek, who worked in the technology sector and had connections throughout the local business community. And she mentioned casually that Derek had been really helpful in making introductions and opening doors for her professionally over the past several months. I said that was nice of him and asked how she knew Derek, and she said they'd met at a networking event earlier in the year and had stayed in touch because they had a lot of overlapping professional interests and contacts, and she characterized their relationship as purely collegial and focused on career development and industry connections. I spent the next several days maintaining the careful facade of a supportive husband who was excited about the upcoming baby, while privately continuing my investigation into Claire's relationship with Derek, and documenting every piece of evidence I could find that would help me understand exactly how long this affair had been going on and what Claire's ultimate plan was for handling the situation. The hardest part of maintaining this facade wasn't pretending to be happy about the pregnancy announcement, because I'd had years of practice staying calm and professional in stressful situations through my work as a fire inspector. But rather, it was living with the constant awareness that my wife was lying to my face every single day, and didn't seem to feel any guilt or remorse about the deception she was perpetrating. On the 5th day after Claire's pregnancy announcement, I was sitting at my desk at the fire station during a slow afternoon when I decided to take another look at our joint bank account statements to see if there were any financial patterns that might tell me something useful about when the affair had started and how much time and money Claire had been investing in this other relationship. I logged into our shared online banking portal and pulled up the transaction history for the past 6 months, and I started scrolling through the list of charges looking for anything that seemed out of the ordinary or didn't match the patterns of spending that I was familiar with from reviewing our monthly statements together. What I found was a series of charges that I'd never noticed before because they were individually small enough that they didn't stand out when I was just glancing at the monthly totals, but when I looked at them collectively over a 6-month period, they told a very clear story about what had been happening. Starting in early January, about 3 months before Claire told me she was pregnant, there were recurring charges at pharmacies and health supplement stores for prenatal vitamins and other pregnancy-related items, which meant Claire had been planning for this pregnancy and preparing her body for it months before she actually conceived. And this level of premeditation suggested that the affair wasn't just a casual mistake or a moment of weakness, but rather a deliberate choice to build a life with someone else while keeping me in the dark about what was really happening. The vitamin purchases were interesting on their own, but what made them even more significant was that they were accompanied by a pattern of other charges that painted a picture of someone who was investing heavily in her appearance and preparing to impress someone important. There were multiple charges at high-end clothing boutiques for outfits that I'd never seen Claire wear around the apartment, and there were regular appointments at expensive salons for hair treatments and manicures that seemed more frequent than what she'd been doing in previous years, and there was even a charge for a personal styling consultation at a department store that specialized in professional wardrobe development for executives and business leaders. I took screenshots of all these transactions and organized them in my documentation folder by category and date. And as I was reviewing the images I'd captured, I realized that the spending pattern had intensified significantly around the time that Derek's LinkedIn profile showed he'd been promoted to Chief Operating Officer at Vertex Solutions, which suggested that Claire had been deliberately upgrading her appearance and presentation to fit into the social circle of someone who was moving into higher levels of corporate leadership. This realization made me wonder whether Claire's interest in Derek was primarily romantic, or whether it was more about attaching herself to someone who could advance her career and provide access to opportunities that wouldn't be available to her through her current position at a mid-sized marketing firm. Later that evening, after I'd finished my shift and driven home, I found Claire sitting at the dining room table with her laptop open working on what she said was a presentation for an important client meeting the next day, and I made us both dinner while she continued typing and occasionally sighing in frustration at whatever she was working on. When the food was ready, I brought it to the table and sat down across from her, and I asked her how the client meeting preparation was going, and she said it was challenging because the client had very specific requirements and she wanted to make sure she delivered exactly what they were expecting. I asked her if this was the same client that Derek had introduced her to, and she looked up from her laptop with a slightly startled expression as if she'd forgotten she'd mentioned Derek's involvement in making that connection, and she said yes, it was that client, and that Derek had been incredibly helpful in explaining what they were looking for and how she should position her firm's capabilities to match their needs. I asked her what Derek got out of being so helpful with her career development, and she said he was just a generous person who believed in supporting other professionals in the industry, and she added that he'd told her he saw a lot of potential in her and thought she was capable of achieving much more than her current role allowed. That comment about Derek seeing potential in Claire and thinking she could achieve more stuck with me after dinner was over, and Claire had gone back to working on her presentation because it suggested that Derek had been actively encouraging Claire to be dissatisfied with her current situation and to imagine a different kind of life where she was more successful and more fulfilled. And that kind of encouragement from someone who wielded real power and influence in the business community would be very seductive to someone like Claire, who had always been ambitious and status conscious. I wondered if Derek had made any specific promises to Claire about helping her advance her career, and whether those promises had been contingent on her leaving me and committing to a relationship with him, because that would explain why she'd been willing to risk her marriage by having an affair that could easily be discovered if I'd been paying closer attention to the details of her daily life. The next morning, I decided to do something that felt slightly risky, but that I thought was necessary to get a complete picture of what I was dealing with, which was to take a closer look at Claire's recent activity on social media and see if there were any public posts or interactions that might reveal more about her relationship with Derek. I waited until Claire had left for her client meeting, and then I opened her various social media profiles on my laptop and started going through her recent posts and the comments people had left on them. And I also looked at the profiles of people she'd recently started following or who had recently started following her to see if there were any patterns that might be significant. What I discovered was that over the past 4 months, Claire had become much more active on LinkedIn specifically, posting regularly about professional development topics and sharing articles about career advancement and workplace culture. And many of her posts had comments from Derek praising her insights or adding his own thoughts that extended the conversation. The tone of these public exchanges was professional and appropriate on the surface, But there was an undercurrent of mutual admiration and personal connection that suggested these two people were communicating on a much deeper level than what was visible to casual observers. And several of Claire's colleagues had left comments on her posts that made joking references to her new mentor or her biggest fan in ways that suggested people in their professional circle had noticed the closeness of her relationship with Derek. I went back through Claire's LinkedIn profile history and found that about 3 weeks ago she'd posted an announcement saying she'd accepted a position as Director of Strategic Marketing at Vertex Solutions starting in about a month. And the post had dozens of congratulatory comments from colleagues and professional contacts, including a lengthy comment from Derek welcoming her to the team and saying he was excited to work with her more closely. This was the first I'd heard about Claire accepting a new job, which meant she'd made a major career decision without discussing it with me, even though we'd always agreed to talk through significant professional moves together, because they affected our household finances and our long-term planning, and the fact that she was going to be working directly for Derek at his company made it very clear that the affair and the job offer were connected in ways that went beyond simple networking or professional courtesy. I took screenshots of Claire's job announcement post and all the comments on it, paying particular attention to the timeline of when she'd accepted the offer relative to when she'd gotten pregnant, and I realized that the job offer had come about 3 months ago, which was right around the time that the prenatal vitamin purchases had started appearing on our joint bank account. This suggested that Claire and Derek had made some kind of plan together where she would leave her current job to work at his company, and they would start a family together. And at some point she would presumably tell me that she was leaving me for him, although I still hadn't figured out exactly when or how she was planning to execute that part of the plan. That evening, I called my sister Rachel, who works as a paralegal at a family law firm downtown, and who I've always been close to, even though we don't see each other as often as we'd like because we're both busy with our careers and our separate lives. I didn't tell Rachel the full story of what was happening with Claire because I wasn't ready to share all the details yet, but I did tell her that I might need some legal advice soon about a sensitive personal matter, and I asked if she'd be willing to meet with me sometime in the next few days to discuss some hypothetical scenarios and help me understand what my options might be. Rachel immediately picked up on the fact that something serious was going on based on the tone of my voice, and she asked me directly if this was about my marriage. And I said yes it was, but I needed some time to gather more information before I could explain everything properly. Rachel said she understood and that she would make time to meet with me whenever I was ready, and she reminded me that even though she worked in family law, she wasn't a licensed attorney yet, so there would be limits to what kind of advice she could give me, but she could definitely help me understand the general legal landscape and connect me with experienced lawyers if I decided I needed formal representation. I thanked her for being willing to help, and told her I'd probably be ready to meet with her within the next week or two once I'd finished documenting everything I needed to document, and she said that was fine and that I should call her any time if I needed to talk before then. After I got off the phone with Rachel, I sat in my home office and thought about what my endgame was supposed to be in all of this, because I'd been so focused on gathering evidence and documenting Claire's lies that I hadn't really thought through what I wanted to happen once I had all the proof I needed. Part of me wanted to confront Claire privately and give her a chance to explain herself and maybe even confess everything voluntarily, but another part of me knew that a private confrontation would just give her the opportunity to lie more convincingly or to manipulate the situation in ways that would make me look like the bad guy for not trusting her. I thought about my training as a fire inspector and how I'd learned that the best way to get to the truth about what caused a fire was to let the physical evidence speak for itself rather than relying on witness statements that could be unreliable or self-serving. And I decided that the same principle applied here. I opened a new document on my laptop and started sketching out a rough timeline of all the events I'd documented so far, starting with the pregnancy test discovery and working forward through Claire's announcement, the ultrasound photo in the cloud storage, the phone call with the clinic receptionist, the financial records showing prenatal vitamin purchases and appearance-related spending, and the LinkedIn posts revealing Claire's new job at Derek's company. I spent the following weekend maintaining my normal routine while Claire went about her days acting like everything was perfectly fine and our marriage was on solid ground, and the disconnect between what I knew to be true and what she was pretending was true became so pronounced that I started to feel like I was living in some kind of alternate reality where the rules of basic honesty and human decency didn't apply anymore. On Saturday morning, Claire suggested we go out for brunch at a place near the waterfront that we used to visit regularly when we first got married, and I agreed because I wanted to see if she would say or do anything that might give me additional insight into what she was planning or when she intended to finally come clean about the affair and the pregnancy. We drove to the restaurant and got a table on the outdoor patio overlooking the marina, and Claire spent most of the meal talking about her excitement for the new job at Vertex Solutions and how she thought this move was going to be transformative for her career in ways that her current position had never allowed. She talked about Derek in glowing terms, describing him as a visionary leader who really understood how to build teams and empower people to do their best work, and she said she felt incredibly lucky that he'd taken an interest in her professional development and had created this opportunity for her to join his company at such a senior level. I listened to her talk about Derek and watched her face light up in ways that I hadn't seen in months, and I realized that whether or not she was consciously aware of it, Claire had already emotionally left our marriage and was building a new life with Derek in her mind even while she was still physically living in our apartment and going through the motions of being my wife. I asked her if she was nervous about starting at a new company, and she said she was a little nervous but mostly excited. And then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand and said she was grateful that I was being so supportive of this career move because she knew it was going to require some adjustments to our routines and schedules. The fact that Claire was thanking me for being supportive of a job change that I hadn't even known about until I'd discovered it through my investigation of her LinkedIn profile was almost darkly funny, and I had to work hard to keep my expression neutral and not say something sarcastic that would reveal how much I actually knew about what was going on. After we finished brunch and drove back home, I told Claire I needed to run some errands and would be out for a few hours, and I drove to a coffee shop across town where I'd arranged to meet with Rachel to finally tell her everything and get her professional opinion on how I should handle the situation legally. Rachel was already at the coffee shop when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with her laptop open and a stack of file folders beside her. And she looked up when I walked in and gave me a concerned smile that told me she'd been worrying about whatever was serious enough to require an emergency weekend meeting. I sat down across from her and spent the next 45 minutes walking her through everything I'd discovered, starting with the pregnancy test in the bathroom trash and ending with the LinkedIn announcement about Claire's new job at Derek's company, and I showed her all the documentation I'd gathered, including the photographs, the bank statements, the social media screenshots, and my detailed timeline of events. Rachel listened without interrupting until I'd finished explaining everything, and then she sat back in her chair and let out a long breath and said that what I was describing was a fairly clear-cut case of paternity fraud, which in our state could be grounds for a civil lawsuit if I wanted to pursue that route. She explained that paternity fraud wasn't a criminal matter, so Claire wouldn't face any jail time or criminal penalties, but I could potentially file a civil claim seeking damages for the emotional distress and financial deception, and more importantly, I could use the documentation I'd gathered as leverage in divorce proceedings to ensure a favorable settlement that wouldn't require me to pay spousal support or take on any financial responsibility for a child that wasn't biologically mine. I asked Rachel what she thought my next steps should be, and she said that depended on what outcome I was hoping to achieve and whether I wanted to handle this situation quietly through private negotiations or whether I wanted to make it public in a way that would have consequences for Claire and Derek beyond just the legal and financial aspects. She pointed out that Derek held a prominent position in the local business community and sat on several boards, and if it became publicly known that he'd been having an affair with a subordinate employee and had gotten her pregnant while she was still married to someone else, there could be professional repercussions for him that might include ethics complaints to the boards he served on, or reputational damage that could affect his standing in the industry. Rachel also mentioned that Claire's acceptance of a senior position at Derek's company while having an undisclosed romantic relationship with him could potentially violate workplace ethics policies or create conflicts of interest that the company's board of directors would need to investigate. And if the affair became public knowledge, it was entirely possible that Claire's job offer could be rescinded or that she could face professional consequences for failing to disclose a personal relationship that affected her professional judgment. I told Rachel that I wasn't necessarily interested in destroying Claire's career or Derek's reputation just for the sake of revenge, but I did want them both to face some kind of accountability for the lies and the betrayal, and I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to be stuck paying for their choices or supporting a child that Derek had fathered while Claire was pretending to be a faithful wife. We talked through several different scenarios for how I could approach the situation, ranging from a private confrontation with Claire where I presented all the evidence and demanded an immediate separation, to a more public exposure that would involve informing Derek's wife if he had one, or notifying the company's board about the ethics violation, or even holding off on any confrontation until after Claire started her new job so that the professional consequences would be more severe. Rachel warned me that the more dramatic and public I made the exposure, the more likely it was that Claire and Derek would fight back by trying to discredit me or paint me as vindictive or unstable, but she also acknowledged that sometimes the only way to get people to take responsibility for their actions was to make sure those actions had real consequences that couldn't be ignored or minimized. After my meeting with Rachel, I drove around the city for a while, just thinking about what I wanted to do and how I wanted this situation to resolve itself, and I kept coming back to the fact that Claire had been planning this betrayal for months and had been carefully documenting her pregnancy journey with Derek through medical appointments and ultrasound photos while lying to my face every single day about what was really happening. The level of deception and premeditation involved in what she'd done went far beyond a simple affair or a moment of weakness, and it suggested a fundamental lack of respect for me and for our marriage that I didn't think could ever be repaired, even if she came to me tomorrow and confessed everything and begged for forgiveness. I thought about the text message I'd photographed from Derek saying he couldn't wait to meet the baby, and I realized that Derek clearly knew about my existence and knew that Claire was married, which meant he'd made a conscious choice to pursue a relationship with a married woman and to start a family with her while she was still living with her husband. That kind of deliberate interference in someone else's marriage suggested a level of arrogance and entitlement that made me think Derek was the kind of person who was used to getting what he wanted without facing consequences, and I found myself wanting to make sure that this time would be different and that he would have to answer for his choices in a way that couldn't be smoothed over or explained away. When I got home that evening, Claire asked me where I'd been all afternoon, and I told her I'd been running errands and had stopped to have coffee with an old friend from my military days who was passing through town, which was a lie, but felt justified given that Claire had been lying to me about much more significant things for much longer. She seemed satisfied with that explanation and went back to watching television while I retreated to my home office to continue building my case file and thinking about the best way to expose the truth in a manner that would maximize the consequences for both Claire and Derek, while minimizing any potential blowback that might make me look like the villain in this situation. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to Claire's schedule and her patterns of communication, and I noticed that she was spending more and more time on her phone texting with someone and smiling at the messages she was receiving in ways that made it obvious she was communicating with Derek even when I was sitting right there in the same room. She'd become careless about hiding her phone or turning it face down when she set it on the table, which suggested she'd grown so comfortable with the deception that she didn't even think about the possibility that I might notice what she was doing or question who she was talking to so constantly. One evening, while Claire was in the shower, I picked up her phone from the nightstand where she'd left it and saw that she had several unread messages from Derek. And even though the phone was locked, I could see the preview text on the notification screen, which included messages about baby names they were considering and discussions about whether they should find out the gender at the next ultrasound appointment or wait until the birth to be surprised. The casual intimacy of these messages and the way they talked about their baby, as if I didn't exist or as if my role in Claire's life was just a temporary inconvenience that would soon be resolved, made me feel a cold rage that I had to consciously suppress, because losing my temper at this point would only give Claire and Derek ammunition to use against me later. I went back to my home office and updated my documentation to include notes about the text message previews I'd seen and the dates and times when I'd observed them, and I started thinking seriously about Rachel's suggestion that I should consider making the exposure as public as possible in order to ensure that Claire and Derek faced real consequences for what they'd done. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that a private confrontation would just allow them to control the narrative and potentially paint themselves as victims of a jealous and controlling husband who couldn't accept that his wife had fallen in love with someone else. But a public exposure with irrefutable evidence would make it impossible for them to deny what had happened or to avoid taking responsibility for their choices. I remembered that Claire had mentioned several weeks ago that her friends were planning to throw her a baby shower sometime in the next few weeks, and at the time I'd thought it was strange that she was already planning a shower when she'd only recently announced the pregnancy and was still in the first trimester, but now I understood that she must have told her close friends about the pregnancy before she told me, which meant there was a whole network of people who knew about the affair and were presumably supporting Claire in her deception. I started making discreet inquiries about when exactly this baby shower was supposed to happen and who was organizing it. And I learned from a casual conversation with Claire one evening that her best friend Tessa was handling all the planning and had reserved space at the community center for an event in about 2.5 weeks on a Saturday afternoon. Claire seemed excited about the shower and mentioned that Tessa was inviting around 40 people, including friends from work, neighbors from our apartment building, some of Claire's former college roommates, and various family members, including Claire's mother Linda, who I'd always gotten along with reasonably well, even though she could be a bit overbearing at times with her opinions about how Claire and I should be living our lives. The mention of 40 guests at the baby shower gave me an idea that I hadn't seriously considered before, which was that this event could serve as the perfect venue for exposing the truth about Claire's affair and the pregnancy in a way that would make it impossible for her to control the narrative or minimize what she'd done. If I waited until the shower was underway and then presented all my evidence in front of everyone who had gathered to celebrate what they thought was my child, the public nature of the revelation would ensure that Claire and Derek couldn't simply brush it off or claim I was overreacting, and the presence of so many witnesses would make it much harder for them to later deny what had happened or rewrite the story to make themselves look better. I spent several days thinking through the logistics of how such a public confrontation would work and what risks it might carry, And I talked through the plan with Rachel during another coffee shop meeting where she expressed some concerns about whether this approach might backfire and make me look vindictive or cruel for embarrassing Claire in front of her friends and family. I acknowledged that there was definitely a risk of looking like the bad guy if I handled this wrong, but I pointed out that Claire had been planning to pass off another man's child as mine for the rest of my life, and that level of deception and betrayal warranted a response that was proportional to the harm she'd intended to cause me. Rachel agreed that I had every right to be angry and to want consequences for what Claire had done, but she cautioned me to make sure that whatever I did was based on presenting facts and evidence rather than emotional outbursts or personal attacks. Because the moment I let my anger take over and started calling Claire names or making accusations that I couldn't prove, I would lose the moral high ground and give her an opportunity to shift the focus away from her behavior and onto my reaction. She suggested that if I was serious about exposing the truth at the baby shower, I should prepare a very simple and direct presentation of the key facts, including the vasectomy documentation, the ultrasound photo with Derek's name tagged, the clinic records showing both their names on the parental file, and the financial records showing the prenatal vitamin purchases that started months before Claire told me she was pregnant. I took Rachel's advice seriously and started putting together a single-page document that laid out the timeline and the evidence in a clear and unemotional way, and I made sure that every piece of information I included could be verified through documentation that I'd obtained legally and legitimately without hacking into anyone's accounts or violating any privacy laws. The document showed the date I'd had my vasectomy 4 years ago, along with the medical records confirming the procedure had been successful, the date I'd found the pregnancy test in our bathroom trash, the date Claire had announced her pregnancy to me, the dates of the prenatal vitamin purchases on our joint bank account that predated her announcement by several months, the metadata from the ultrasound photo showing Derek's name as a tag, and the information from the clinic receptionist confirming that both Claire and Derek were listed on the parental medical records. I also included a screenshot of the text message preview I'd photographed from Claire's phone where Derek said he couldn't wait to meet the baby, and I added a note explaining that Claire had accepted a senior position at Derek's company that she would be starting in just a few weeks, which established a clear connection between the affair and her professional advancement. When I looked at the finished document, I felt confident that anyone who saw it would understand immediately what had happened and would recognize that this wasn't a case of a paranoid husband making unfounded accusations, but rather a systematic pattern of deception that Claire and Derek had been carrying out together for months. The next challenge was figuring out exactly how I would present this information at the baby shower in a way that would be effective without being unnecessarily cruel to the guests who would be caught off guard by the revelation, and I decided that the best approach would be to wait until near the end of the event, when people had already given their gifts and had their cake and were starting to think about heading home. I would ask for everyone's attention and say that I had something important to share, and then I would simply ask Claire one direct question in front of everyone, which would be who the father of the baby really was, and I would let her response determine how much of the evidence I needed to present to make my point. I contacted Margaret Townsend, who managed the community center where the shower was being held, and I asked her if it would be possible for me to use the facility's projector during the event to show some photos, and she said that wouldn't be a problem as long as I coordinated with Tessa about the timing so it didn't interfere with any of the planned activities. I told Margaret I was planning a surprise slideshow of photos from Claire's and my relationship over the years, which was technically true even though the photos I actually planned to show were of a very different nature than what Margaret was probably imagining, and she said that sounded lovely and she was sure Claire would appreciate the gesture. With the logistics for the shower confrontation starting to fall into place, I turned my attention back to gathering any remaining evidence that might strengthen my case or provide additional context for what had been happening, and I decided to take one more look at Claire's social media activity to see if there were any recent posts or interactions that might be relevant. What I found was that just a few days earlier, Claire had updated her Facebook relationship status to remove any mention of being married, and while her profile still technically listed me as her spouse in the basic information section, the prominent relationship status field that appeared at the top of her timeline now showed nothing at all, which suggested she was already starting to prepare her social network for the eventual announcement that she was leaving me. I took a screenshot of Claire's updated profile showing the blank relationship status field along with the date of the change, and I added it to my evidence collection as another piece of the puzzle that demonstrated Claire had been planning her exit from our marriage while simultaneously maintaining the pretense that everything was fine between us. I also noticed that she'd posted several photos from recent outings and dinners that I hadn't been aware of, and in several of these photos she was dressed in the expensive new clothes that I'd seen charges for on our joint bank account, which confirmed my suspicion that she'd been investing heavily in her appearance specifically for the purpose of impressing Derek and fitting into his social circle. One evening, about a week before the scheduled baby shower, I came home from work to find Claire sitting at the dining room table with her mother, Linda, and the two of them were looking at baby furniture catalogs and discussing color schemes for what Claire was calling the nursery, even though we lived in a 2-bedroom apartment that didn't have a spare room that could be converted into a nursery without significant reorganization. Linda looked up when I walked in and said hello in a friendly tone, and then she made a comment that caught me completely off guard, which was that she was so excited to finally meet the other father at the baby shower next weekend because Claire had told her so much about him. Claire's face went pale when her mother said that, and she immediately jumped in to correct Linda by saying that Linda must have misunderstood something Claire had said earlier, and that Owen was the father, and there wasn't any other father involved in the situation. Linda looked confused and said she was certain Claire had mentioned someone named Derek, who was going to be very involved in the baby's life, and Claire said yes. Derek was a close friend and colleague who was being supportive during the pregnancy, but that didn't make him the other father in any meaningful sense. I stayed quiet during this exchange and just watched the panic in Claire's eyes as she tried to manage her mother's innocent but devastating slip of the tongue, and I made a mental note to include this conversation in my documentation because it showed that Claire had been telling her own mother about Derek's role in the pregnancy, which meant the deception wasn't just something she was perpetrating against me, but was part of a larger pattern of dishonesty that extended to her entire social network. After Linda left that evening, I asked Claire casually what her mother had meant about meeting someone at the baby shower, and Claire said her mother sometimes got confused and mixed up details from different conversations, and that she'd probably been talking about meeting some of Claire's work colleagues who would be attending the event. I said that made sense and let the subject drop, but internally I was adding this incident to the growing list of times when Claire had been caught in a lie or had to scramble to cover up something she'd said that revealed more than she intended. The following day, I received a text message from Tessa asking if I would be willing to help set up the decorations and tables at the community center on the morning of the baby shower, and I replied that I would be happy to help and asked what time I should arrive. Tessa said she'd be there around noon to start setting up, and the shower was scheduled to begin at 2, so if I could come around noon, that would be perfect. I agreed to be there at noon, and I made a mental note that this would give me an opportunity to confirm that the projector was working properly and to do a quick technical run-through of my presentation without anyone questioning what I was doing. As the baby shower approached, I found myself feeling surprisingly calm about what I was planning to do, and I realized that this sense of calm came from the fact that I'd spent weeks methodically gathering evidence and planning my approach, and I knew that I had an airtight case that couldn't be disputed or explained away with convenient lies. I'd learned from my years as a fire inspector that the best way to handle high-stress situations was to prepare thoroughly and then trust in the preparation when the moment came to act, and I felt confident that I'd done everything I could to ensure that the truth would come out in a way that was clear and undeniable. I also spent some time thinking about what would happen after the shower confrontation, and I accepted that there would probably be a period of chaos and conflict where Claire and Derek would try to minimize what they'd done or shift blame onto me for handling the situation the way I did, but I was prepared for that possibility and had already started making arrangements to stay with Rachel for a few days after the shower in case Claire became hostile or tried to prevent me from leaving the apartment with my belongings. Rachel had also helped me prepare a formal separation agreement that I could present to Claire immediately after the shower confrontation, and the agreement laid out very clear terms for how we would divide our assets and terminate our joint financial accounts, and it included a clause explicitly stating that I would have no financial responsibility for any child that wasn't biologically mine. The night before the baby shower, I barely slept because my mind kept running through different scenarios for how the confrontation might unfold and what Claire's reaction would be when I asked her the question in front of 40 witnesses, who had all gathered to celebrate what they believed was a joyous occasion. I kept thinking about the moment when I would connect my laptop to the projector and display the vasectomy records on the screen behind Claire while she sat surrounded by gifts and decorations and all the trappings of a celebration that was based on a fundamental lie, and I wondered whether she would try to deny everything, even when confronted with irrefutable evidence, or whether she would finally break down and admit the truth about her relationship with Derek and the fact that he was the biological father of the child she was carrying. I also thought about Derek and whether he would actually attend the baby shower as Claire's mother had suggested, because if he was there in the room when I revealed the evidence, it would make the confrontation even more powerful and would prevent him from later claiming that he hadn't known Claire was married or that he'd been deceived about the nature of their relationship. Part of me hoped he would be there so he would have to face the consequences of his actions in real time rather than hearing about the confrontation secondhand and having time to prepare his defense, but another part of me recognized that his presence might complicate things and could potentially lead to a physical altercation if he tried to defend Claire or challenge my right to expose what they'd been doing. I got out of bed around 6 in the morning, even though the shower wasn't until 2 in the afternoon, and I spent a few hours reviewing my evidence folder one final time and making sure that all the files were properly organized and would display correctly when I connected my laptop to the projector at the community center. I created a simple slideshow presentation with just 5 slides that would tell the story clearly and efficiently without requiring me to provide a lot of verbal explanation, and the slides showed my vasectomy record with the date clearly visible, the pregnancy test photograph with the newspaper date stamp, the ultrasound image metadata showing Derek's name as a tag, a screenshot of our joint bank account with the prenatal vitamin purchases highlighted, and finally the text message preview from Derek talking about meeting the baby. Claire woke up around 9 and seemed excited and nervous about the shower in equal measure, and she spent most of the morning getting ready and trying on different outfits before settling on a pale blue dress that showed off her still relatively flat stomach and made her look young and radiant in a way that would have made me happy under different circumstances. She asked me several times if I was planning to stay for the whole shower, or if I was just going to drop by briefly, and I told her that I would definitely be there for the whole event because I wanted to celebrate this important milestone with her, and all the people who cared about her, which was true even though the celebration I had in mind was very different from what she was anticipating. I arrived at the community center at noon as planned and found Tessa already there, unloading boxes of decorations from her car, and I helped her carry everything inside, and we spent the next hour setting up tables and hanging streamers and arranging the gift table near the front of the room where Claire would sit to open presents. Tessa chatted cheerfully the whole time about how excited she was for Claire, and how she thought Claire was going to be an amazing mother, and I made appropriate responses while internally thinking about how Tessa's perception of the situation was about to be shattered along with everyone else's when I revealed the truth about the pregnancy. While Tessa was busy arranging flowers in vases, I took the opportunity to test the projector setup and make sure my laptop would connect properly to the community center's audio-visual system, and I ran through my slideshow presentation once to confirm that all the images were displaying at the right size and resolution and that the text was readable from the back of the room. Margaret Townsend came by while I was testing the equipment and asked if everything was working properly, and I told her it was all set and thanked her for making the projector available on short notice, and she said she was happy to help and that she hoped Claire would enjoy the surprise photo presentation I'd mentioned earlier. By 1:30, the room was fully decorated with pink and white balloons forming an arch over the gift table, and hand-lettered signs saying baby shower and congratulations Claire hanging on the walls, and Tessa had set up a table with refreshments including punch and cookies and small sandwiches cut into decorative shapes. Guests started arriving around 1:45, and I positioned myself near the entrance to greet people and direct them to sign the guest book that Tessa had set up on a small table by the door, and I made note of who was attending so I would know exactly how many witnesses would be present when I made my revelation. Claire's mother, Linda, arrived early along with several of Claire's aunts and cousins, and they all seemed genuinely happy and excited to be celebrating the pregnancy, and I felt a small pang of guilt knowing that I was about to ruin what they thought was a happy family occasion, but I reminded myself that the situation wasn't my fault and that Claire was the one who had created this mess by choosing to have an affair and lie about the paternity of her child. Several of Claire's work colleagues arrived in a group, including a few people I recognized from office parties and company events that I'd attended with Claire in the past, and they were followed by neighbors from our apartment building and some of Claire's friends from college who I'd met a handful of times over the years. Claire arrived fashionably late at about 2:15, looking beautiful and happy, and she made a grand entrance through the door while everyone applauded and cheered, and she hugged Tessa and thanked her for organizing everything, and then made her way around the room, greeting guests and accepting congratulations. I stayed in the background during these initial greetings and watched Claire work the room with the kind of social grace and charm that had always been one of her strengths, and I noticed that she seemed genuinely joyful in a way that made me think she'd managed to compartmentalize the deception so thoroughly that she didn't even feel guilty about what she was doing anymore. About 20 minutes after Claire arrived, I saw Derek walk through the door, accompanied by a woman I assumed must be his wife, based on the way she had her arm linked through his, and my heart started beating faster because I hadn't been entirely sure he would actually show up, but his presence was going to make the confrontation significantly more impactful. Derek was tall and well-dressed in the kind of expensive casual clothes that successful executives wear to weekend social events, and he had an air of confidence and self-assurance that probably served him well in board meetings and business negotiations, but was going to work against him very shortly when I revealed what he'd been doing with my wife. Derek and his wife made their way over to Claire, and there was a somewhat awkward moment where the three of them stood together making small talk, and I watched Derek's wife chatting pleasantly with Claire, apparently having no idea that her husband had been having an affair with the pregnant woman standing in front of her. I felt a moment of sympathy for Derek's wife because she was clearly an innocent victim in this situation just like I was, and I made a mental note to make sure that my presentation of the evidence would make it clear that Derek had been an active and willing participant in the affair, rather than somehow being seduced or manipulated by Claire. The shower proceeded according to the standard format, with people eating refreshments and playing silly games that Tessa had organized, and there was a game where people had to guess the baby's gender, and another game where people had to guess Claire's measurements. And everyone seemed to be having a good time in that slightly forced way that people do at obligatory social events, where they're expected to be enthusiastic and positive regardless of how they actually feel. I participated minimally in the games and spent most of my time observing the room and making sure I knew where everyone was positioned, and I confirmed that Derek and his wife were seated about 3 rows back from where Claire was sitting in the place of honor near the gift table. Around 3 o'clock, Tessa announced that it was time for Claire to open presents, and everyone gathered their chairs in a semicircle facing the gift table, while Claire sat down and prepared to open the stack of wrapped packages that guests had brought. I watched as Claire opened the first few gifts and made appropriate, excited noises about baby clothes and stuffed animals and various pieces of nursery equipment, and the guests were all smiling and taking photos and making comments about how cute everything was. And the whole scene had a surreal quality, because I knew that in just a few minutes this cheerful celebration was going to turn into something very different. After Claire had opened about half the gifts, I caught Margaret's eye and gave her a small nod, and she understood that this was my signal that I was ready to do the photo presentation I'd mentioned, and she came over and quietly asked if now would be a good time to show the pictures. I said yes, that would be perfect, and Margaret made an announcement to the room that Claire's husband had prepared a special surprise, and everyone should pay attention to the screen at the front of the room. I stood up and walked to where my laptop was already connected to the projector, and I saw Claire look at me with a slightly confused expression, as if she was trying to figure out what I could possibly be planning to show. I opened my laptop, and the projector screen lit up with the first slide of my presentation, but I didn't advance to show the actual content yet, because I wanted to ask my question first and give Claire a chance to answer before I presented the evidence. The room got quiet as everyone waited to see what was going to appear on the screen, and I took a deep breath and looked directly at Claire sitting there surrounded by baby gifts and decorations and 40 people who had come to celebrate her pregnancy, and I asked in a calm and clear voice that carried across the entire room the question that I'd been rehearsing in my mind for weeks, which was simply this: Claire, who is the father of your baby, really? The silence that followed my question was absolute and seemed to stretch on for much longer than the few seconds it actually lasted, and I could see Claire's face go through several different expressions in rapid succession, starting with confusion, then recognition as she realized what I was asking, then fear as she understood that I knew something, and finally a forced smile as she tried to laugh off the question and say, "You are silly, why would you even ask that?" I let her answer hang in the air for a moment, and then without saying anything else, I pressed the button to advance to the first slide of my presentation, which showed my vasectomy documentation with the date from 4 years ago clearly visible, along with the medical confirmation that the procedure had been successful and had resulted in permanent sterilization. The room erupted in gasps and confused murmuring as people tried to process what they were seeing on the screen, and I watched Claire's forced smile collapse completely as she realized that I had actual documentation, and this wasn't just a paranoid accusation that she could talk her way out of. I advanced to the next slide without giving Claire a chance to formulate a response to the vasectomy documentation, and the screen now showed the photograph I'd taken of the pregnancy test sitting on our bathroom counter, with that morning's newspaper clearly visible in the frame, providing an undeniable timestamp that proved when I'd discovered the test and began documenting the evidence of Claire's deception. The murmuring in the room grew louder as people started to understand that this wasn't just some kind of misunderstanding or technical error with the medical records, but rather a carefully documented case of infidelity and betrayal, and I could see several guests turning to look at each other with shocked expressions, while others kept their eyes fixed on the screen trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. Claire tried to stand up from her chair near the gift table, but her legs seemed unsteady and she had to grab the edge of the table to support herself. And she started to say something about how this was all a huge mistake and I was embarrassing her in front of her friends and family, but her voice was shaky and unconvincing in a way that made it clear she knew she'd been caught and was just trying to minimize the damage. I let her speak for a few seconds, and then I advanced to the third slide, which showed the ultrasound image metadata with Derek Ashford's name clearly visible in the tag field. And I also included a smaller inset image showing the deletion date, which proved that Claire had tried to hide this evidence after realizing that we shared a cloud storage account where I might eventually see it. The mention of Derek's name caused an immediate reaction in the room as people who knew him professionally or socially started looking around to see if he was actually present at the baby shower, and I saw Derek's wife turn to stare at her husband with an expression of dawning horror as she began to understand what the evidence on the screen was suggesting about his relationship with Claire. Derek himself had gone very pale and was half standing from his chair, as if he was trying to decide whether to flee the room or stay and try to defend himself. And I could see the panic in his eyes as he realized that his carefully constructed public image as a successful and ethical business leader was about to be destroyed in front of dozens of witnesses. I advanced to the fourth slide, which showed our joint bank account statement with the prenatal vitamin purchases highlighted in yellow, and I'd included annotations showing the dates of these purchases and noting that they had started more than 3 months before Claire had announced her pregnancy to me, which proved that the pregnancy had been planned and prepared for rather than being some kind of accident or surprise. This slide also included several other highlighted charges for maternity clothing and high-end salon services that demonstrated Claire had been investing significant amounts of our shared money into preparing for a pregnancy and maintaining an appearance that would be appropriate for someone dating a corporate executive, and the financial evidence made it impossible for anyone in the room to claim that this had been a brief moment of weakness or a mistake that Claire regretted. Claire was openly crying now and trying to push her way through the crowd toward the exit, but several people, including her mother Linda and her friend Tessa, were blocking her path either intentionally or simply because they were too shocked to move out of the way, and Linda was demanding to know what was going on and whether the evidence on the screen was really true or if there was some other explanation that would make sense of what she was seeing. I saw Tessa turn to look at me with an expression that was equal parts anger and confusion, and she asked in a loud voice whether I had known about this evidence before the baby shower, and if so, why I had waited until now to reveal it instead of handling the situation privately like a reasonable person would. I didn't answer Tessa's question directly because I didn't owe her or anyone else an explanation for my timing, and instead I advanced to the fifth and final slide, which showed the text message preview I'd photographed from Claire's phone where Derek had written that he couldn't wait to meet the baby, and this slide also included a screenshot of Claire's LinkedIn post announcing her new position as Director of Strategic Marketing at Vertex Solutions, which was the company where Derek served as Chief Operating Officer. The juxtaposition of these two pieces of evidence made it crystal clear that the affair and the job offer were connected, and that Claire had leveraged her relationship with Derek to advance her career, while simultaneously planning to start a family with him and eventually leave me once she was established in her new position. The room had descended into complete chaos by this point, with multiple conversations happening simultaneously as people processed what they'd seen and tried to figure out what it meant for their relationships with Claire, and whether they should stay or leave or try to offer some kind of support to someone in this impossible situation. Derek's wife had stood up and was now confronting him directly in front of everyone, and I could hear her voice rising as she demanded to know how long the affair had been going on and whether he had any other secret children or relationships that she didn't know about, and Derek was stammering and trying to deny everything, even though the evidence on the screen behind me made his denials sound absurd and desperate. My sister Rachel, who had been sitting quietly near the back of the room throughout the entire presentation, now stood up and walked calmly toward the exit door, which she positioned herself in front of, and when Derek tried to push past her to leave the community center, she physically blocked his path, and told him in a clear voice that he should probably stay and answer some questions before running away from the situation he'd created. Derek looked at Rachel with an expression of outrage and demanded to know who she was and what right she had to prevent him from leaving, and Rachel replied calmly that she was my sister and a paralegal who specialized in family law, and that Derek should be aware that his presence at this baby shower as a guest celebrating a pregnancy that he had caused while Claire was married to someone else could be used as evidence in civil proceedings related to paternity fraud and alienation of affection. The mention of legal proceedings seemed to drain what little remaining color there was from Derek's face, and he stopped trying to push past Rachel and instead turned to look at Claire as if hoping she would somehow rescue him from this situation or provide an explanation that would make everything okay. Claire was still crying and had now collapsed back into her chair near the gift table with her mother Linda standing over her demanding answers about what had really been going on and how long she'd been lying to her family about the pregnancy and her marriage, and Linda's voice had taken on a tone of genuine hurt and betrayal as she realized that her daughter had not only deceived her husband, but had also been lying to her own mother about something as fundamental as who had fathered her grandchild. I walked over to where Margaret Townsend was standing near the refreshment table, looking absolutely mortified about what was happening in her community center, and I handed her a printed copy of the civil filing receipt that Rachel had helped me prepare, and I explained quietly that I wanted to make sure the community center had documentation that a formal incident report had been filed regarding the disclosure of fraudulent information at a private event held on their premises. Margaret took the document with shaking hands and said she would make sure it was properly logged in the facility's records, and then she asked in a small voice whether I needed her to call the police or provide any other kind of assistance, and I told her that wouldn't be necessary because this was a civil matter rather than a criminal one and no one was in any physical danger. Several of the guests had started leaving at this point because they clearly didn't want to be present for whatever was going to happen next, and I noticed that most of the people who were leaving were Claire's work colleagues who probably wanted to distance themselves from the scandal before it affected their own professional reputations. The guests who remained were mostly family members and close friends who seemed to feel obligated to stay either to support Claire or to get answers about what had really been happening, and I could see small groups forming throughout the room as people huddled together to discuss what they'd just witnessed and what it meant for their relationships with everyone involved. Derek's wife had now moved away from Derek and was standing near the door talking quietly with Rachel, and I could see Rachel showing her something on her phone, which I assumed was contact information for divorce attorneys or resources for people dealing with marital infidelity. Derek himself was standing alone in the middle of the room, looking lost and defeated. And when he finally noticed that his wife was talking to Rachel, he started to walk toward them, but stopped when Rachel held up one hand in a clear gesture that told him to keep his distance. I saw Derek's wife nod at something Rachel said, and then she walked out of the community center without looking back at Derek, and a few seconds later I heard a car engine start in the parking lot as she drove away, leaving her husband stranded at a baby shower that had turned into the public exposure of his affair. Claire had stopped crying and was now just sitting in her chair staring at the pile of opened baby gifts surrounding her, and she had a strange blank expression on her face as if her mind had completely shut down in response to the overwhelming stress and humiliation of having her deception revealed in front of so many people. Tessa was still standing next to Claire, trying to offer some kind of comfort or support, but Claire wasn't responding to anything Tessa said and just continued staring at the gifts as if she couldn't quite process how her celebration had turned into a disaster. Linda had moved away from Claire and was now talking with some of Claire's aunts, and I could hear snippets of their conversation where Linda was saying things like, "I can't believe she lied to all of us," and "How am I supposed to face my friends after this?" which suggested that Linda was more concerned about her own embarrassment than about supporting her daughter through the consequences of her choices. I disconnected my laptop from the projector and closed it, and I walked over to where Rachel was still standing by the door, and she handed me a folder containing copies of the separation agreement we'd prepared along with documentation about how to initiate divorce proceedings and information about my rights regarding any financial obligations related to a child that wasn't biologically mine. Rachel said quietly that I should probably leave now before Claire or Derek recovered enough to start making accusations or trying to turn the situation around by claiming I'd handled things inappropriately, and I agreed that it was time to go because I'd accomplished what I'd set out to do, which was to expose the truth in a way that couldn't be denied or minimized. As Rachel and I were walking toward the exit, Derek suddenly called out my name and started moving toward us, and for a moment I thought he was going to try to physically confront me or demand some kind of apology for embarrassing him in front of his colleagues and social circle. But when he reached us, he just stood there looking defeated and said in a quiet voice that he wanted me to know he hadn't meant for things to turn out this way and that he genuinely believed Claire was going to tell me about the affair and leave the marriage before the pregnancy progressed much further. I looked at Derek for a long moment and then told him that what he believed or intended didn't really matter because the reality was that he'd pursued a relationship with a married woman and had been perfectly happy to let me continue thinking I was going to be a father to his child if that's what made things easier for him and Claire. Derek opened his mouth as if he was going to argue with what I'd said or try to justify his actions by explaining how he and Claire had fallen in love and hadn't planned for things to happen the way they did. But before he could get any words out, Rachel stepped between us and told Derek very firmly that he should consult with an attorney before having any further conversations with me because anything he said at this point could potentially be used against him in civil proceedings. Derek looked startled by Rachel's intervention and seemed to finally realize that the legal consequences of what he'd done might extend beyond just the social embarrassment of having his affair exposed at a baby shower, and he took a step backward and said, he thought we should all just calm down and handle this situation like adults without getting lawyers involved or making things more complicated than they needed to be. I told Derek that the situation was already extremely complicated because he and Claire had spent months building a secret relationship while lying to everyone around them, including their own family members and the spouse who had trusted them, and that I wasn't interested in handling things like adults, if that meant sweeping everything under the rug and pretending that what they'd done was somehow understandable or forgivable. Rachel added that Derek should be particularly concerned about the professional ethics implications of having hired Claire for a senior position at his company while conducting a romantic relationship with her, because that kind of conflict of interest could expose both him and Vertex Solutions to complaints from other employees who might claim they'd been passed over for promotions in favor of someone who was sleeping with the chief operating officer. The mention of potential workplace ethics violations seemed to genuinely frighten Derek in a way that the personal and social consequences hadn't, and I could see him doing mental calculations about how much damage this scandal could do to his career and his standing in the business community if it became widely known that he'd been using his position to advance his mistress while she was still married to someone else. He started to say something about how Claire's hiring had been based entirely on merit and had been approved by multiple people in the company's leadership team, but Rachel cut him off and said that the appearance of impropriety was often just as damaging as actual impropriety in corporate ethics cases, and that Derek's best course of action at this point would be to stop talking and start preparing for the possibility that Claire's job offer might need to be rescinded or restructured to avoid the appearance that it had been contingent on their personal relationship. I left Rachel to continue her conversation with Derek and walked back into the main room of the community center where the remaining guests were still standing around in small groups, looking uncomfortable and uncertain about whether they should stay or go, or try to clean up the decorations and gifts that were scattered everywhere. Claire was no longer sitting by the gift table, and I didn't immediately see where she'd gone, but then I noticed that the door to the community center's small kitchen area was partially open, and I could hear Claire's voice coming from inside, along with what sounded like Tessa trying to calm her down. I walked over to the kitchen door and pushed it open enough to see Claire sitting on a folding chair with her face in her hands, while Tessa stood next to her holding a glass of water and speaking in low, soothing tones about how everything was going to be okay and they would figure out a way to get through this situation. Claire looked up when she heard the door open, and our eyes met for the first time since I'd asked my question and displayed the evidence on the projector screen. And for just a moment I saw something in her expression that might have been genuine remorse or shame, but then her face hardened, and she said in a voice that was thick with anger and tears that I'd had no right to humiliate her in front of her friends and family, and that I'd deliberately chosen the cruelest possible way to handle a situation that could have been resolved through private conversation and mediation. I told Claire that she'd given up any right to demand privacy or consideration when she'd spent months lying to me about carrying another man's child and planning to pass that child off as mine for the rest of our lives, and that if she felt humiliated by having her deception exposed, then maybe she should have thought about those consequences before she decided to have an affair with her future boss while still married to me. Tessa spoke up at that point and said that while she understood I was hurt and angry about what Claire had done, she thought I'd gone too far by turning a baby shower into a public spectacle, and that I'd traumatized not just Claire, but also all the innocent guests who'd come to celebrate what they thought was a happy occasion. I looked at Tessa and told her that every single person in that room had been participating in a celebration based on a lie, and that they had all been planning to congratulate me on becoming a father to a child that wasn't mine, and that I'd had a vasectomy specifically to avoid having, and that I'd chosen to reveal the truth publicly precisely because it was the only way to ensure that Claire and Derek couldn't later rewrite the story or claim that I was making unfounded accusations based on paranoia or jealousy. Claire stood up from her chair and walked toward me with an expression that was equal parts rage and desperation, and she demanded to know how long I'd known about the pregnancy before today, and why I'd been pretending that everything was fine if I'd already decided our marriage was over. I told her I'd known since the day I found the pregnancy test in our bathroom trash more than 3 weeks ago, and that I'd spent those weeks gathering evidence and documenting her lies because I'd learned from my work as a fire inspector that the best way to establish the truth about any situation was to collect facts systematically rather than relying on emotional confrontations where people could deny or minimize what they'd done. Claire's face went even paler when she realized I'd been investigating her for weeks while continuing to act like a supportive husband, and she said it was sick and twisted that I'd been planning this public humiliation while sleeping next to her every night and pretending to be excited about the baby. I told Claire that what was actually sick and twisted was conducting a months-long affair with a married woman and getting her pregnant while she was still living with her husband, and that if she thought my response to that betrayal was disproportionate or cruel, then she had a fundamentally distorted sense of right and wrong that explained how she'd been able to lie to my face every single day without apparently feeling any guilt. Tessa tried to interrupt at that point and suggested that maybe we should all take a break and continue this conversation later when emotions weren't running quite so high, but Claire waved her off and said she wanted to know exactly what I was planning to do next and whether I was going to file for divorce or if I expected her to leave our apartment or what the logistics were going to be for ending our marriage. I handed Claire one of the folders Rachel had prepared, which contained a copy of the separation agreement and information about the divorce process, and I told her that the agreement laid out very clearly what I was proposing in terms of asset division and financial arrangements, and that the most important provision was the clause stating that I would have absolutely no financial responsibility for any child that wasn't biologically mine, regardless of whether Claire chose to continue her relationship with Derek or raise the baby on her own. Claire took the folder and flipped through the pages without really reading them, and then she threw the whole thing on the floor and said she wasn't going to sign anything until she'd had a chance to consult with her own lawyer and figure out what her rights were in this situation. I told Claire that was fine, and she should absolutely get legal advice before signing anything, but that she should be aware that I had extensive documentation of her affair and the paternity fraud she'd been planning to commit, and that any lawyer she consulted would probably advise her that fighting the separation agreement would be expensive and ultimately futile, given the strength of the evidence I'd collected. Claire said she didn't care about the evidence because she was going to tell everyone that I'd been a controlling and emotionally abusive husband who had driven her into Derek's arms by refusing to support her career ambitions and making her feel trapped in a marriage that had stopped being fulfilling years ago, and that once people heard her side of the story, they would understand that the situation was much more complicated than the simple narrative of betrayal that I was trying to present to. I felt a flash of genuine anger at Claire's threat to reframe the situation as somehow being my fault for not being a good enough husband, and I told her that she was welcome to try that strategy if she thought it would work, but that she should keep in mind that I had dated evidence of prenatal vitamin purchases starting months before she announced the pregnancy, medical records showing both her name and Derek's name on the parental file at the clinic, text messages where Derek discussed meeting the baby, and cloud photo metadata proving she'd taken ultrasound pictures and tagged them with Derek's name before trying to delete them. I said that all of this documentation established a clear pattern of premeditation and deception that would be very difficult to explain away by claiming I'd been emotionally abusive, and that most people who looked at the evidence objectively would conclude that she'd made deliberate choices to have an affair and get pregnant with Derek's child while actively lying to me about what was happening. Claire's face crumpled, and she started crying again, and this time the tears seemed more genuine than the earlier emotional displays which had felt at least partially performative, and she said in a broken voice that she'd never meant for things to get this complicated, and that she genuinely believed Derek when he said he was going to leave his wife and commit to building a life with her and the baby. I felt a small spark of something that might have been pity when I heard Claire admit that she'd been planning a future with Derek and had believed his promises about leaving his wife, because it suggested that she might have been as much a victim of Derek's manipulation as I was. But then I remembered all the lies she'd told me over the past months, and the way she'd looked me in the eye while accepting my congratulations about a pregnancy that she knew wasn't mine. And whatever sympathy I might have felt evaporated immediately. I told Claire that whatever promises Derek had made to her were between the two of them, and didn't change the fundamental fact that she'd chosen to betray our marriage vows and lie to me repeatedly about something that would have affected the entire rest of my life if I hadn't discovered the truth. Tessa spoke up again and said that maybe Claire had made some poor choices, but that she was still a human being who deserved compassion and support rather than public humiliation and abandonment. And I told Tessa that I wasn't interested in her opinions about compassion, given that she'd been helping Claire plan a baby shower to celebrate a pregnancy based on fraud, and had apparently known or suspected that something wasn't right, but had chosen to support Claire's deception rather than encouraging her to be honest with me. Tessa looked shocked and hurt by my accusation, and said she hadn't known anything about the affair or the paternity question until today's revelation, but I wasn't sure I believed her because Claire's mother Linda had made that comment about the other father, which suggested that Claire had been talking to people in her inner circle about Derek's involvement in the pregnancy. I left Claire and Tessa in the kitchen and walked back out to the main room where I found Linda standing near the gift table staring at the pile of opened presents with an expression that suggested she was trying to process how her daughter's celebration had turned into such a complete disaster in the span of less than 30 minutes. Linda looked up when she heard me approaching, and her face immediately shifted from confused sadness to something closer to anger, and she said in a sharp tone that regardless of what Claire had done wrong, I should be ashamed of myself for choosing to expose her mistakes in such a public and humiliating way, instead of handling the situation privately like decent people do when their marriages run into trouble. I told Linda that her daughter had been planning to commit paternity fraud by passing off another man's child as mine for the rest of my life, and that this wasn't a simple mistake or a marriage running into trouble, but rather a systematic pattern of deception that had involved lying to me. Lying to medical professionals by putting Derek's name on parental records, and lying to her own family about who the father of the baby actually was. Linda's expression softened slightly when I mentioned the medical records and the extent of Claire's deception, and she admitted quietly that she had been confused by some things Claire had said over the past few weeks about Derek being involved in the baby's life, but she'd assumed Claire was just talking about having supportive friends and colleagues rather than revealing that Derek was actually the biological father. I asked Linda directly whether she'd known about the affair or had suspected that something inappropriate was happening between Claire and Derek, and Linda hesitated for a long moment before saying that she'd noticed Claire seemed happier and more energized over the past few months in a way that didn't quite match with how she talked about her marriage to me, but Linda had assumed Claire was just excited about her career advancement and the new opportunities that were opening up for her professionally. I told Linda that her assumption had been partially correct because Claire's relationship with Derek was clearly tied to her career ambitions and the job offer she'd received at his company, but that didn't make the affair any less real, or the deception any less damaging to everyone who had been lied to about what was actually happening. Linda said she understood why I was angry and hurt, but that she hoped I would consider the fact that Claire was still her daughter and was going to need support from her family as she figured out how to move forward with her pregnancy and her life, and Linda asked whether I would be willing to at least have a calm conversation with Claire in a few days once everyone had had time to process what had happened and think about what came next. I told Linda that I was willing to have whatever conversations were necessary to finalize the separation and divorce proceedings, but that I had no interest in trying to repair my relationship with Claire or in playing any role in her life going forward beyond what was legally required to untangle our shared finances and terminate our marriage. Linda looked like she wanted to argue with me or try to convince me that I was being too harsh and unforgiving, but before she could say anything else, we were interrupted by Margaret Townsend, who came over to tell us that she needed to start closing up the community center because there was another event scheduled to use the space in a few hours, and she needed time to clean up and reset the room. I looked around and realized that most of the guests had left by this point, and the only people remaining were Linda, a few of Claire's aunts, who were talking quietly in a corner, Tessa, who had emerged from the kitchen looking exhausted and defeated, and Derek, who was sitting alone near the entrance, looking at his phone with an expression that suggested he'd just received some very bad news. Rachel was standing near the door, talking quietly with Margaret about the incident report documentation, and when she saw me looking in her direction, she wrapped up her conversation and walked over to tell me that we should probably leave soon, because there wasn't anything more to be accomplished by staying at the community center, and the situation was only going to get more complicated if Claire or Derek tried to engage us in further confrontations. I agreed with Rachel's assessment and told Linda that she should make sure Claire had a way to get home because I obviously wasn't going to be driving her, and Linda said that Tessa had already offered to take Claire back to Linda's house, where Claire would be staying for at least the next few days until she figured out what her longer-term living arrangements were going to be. I nodded and started walking toward the exit with Rachel, but before we reached the door, Derek stood up from where he'd been sitting and called out my name again in a voice that sounded desperate and pleading in a way that was very different from his earlier attempts at justification or explanation. I stopped and turned to look at Derek, but didn't say anything or make any move to approach him, and after a moment of uncomfortable silence, he said that he'd just gotten a call from Vertex Solutions' general counsel, who had been contacted by someone who attended the baby shower and wanted to report a potential ethics violation involving the chief operating officer and a newly hired employee. Derek said the general counsel had informed him that there would need to be a formal investigation into his relationship with Claire and the circumstances surrounding her job offer, and that he was being placed on administrative leave effective immediately pending the outcome of that investigation, which would likely take several weeks to complete. Derek seemed to be telling me this information as if he expected me to feel some kind of sympathy for him, or as if he thought I might be willing to contact the general counsel and explain that the situation wasn't as bad as it looked. But I just stared at him for a moment and then told him that he should have thought about the professional consequences before he started an affair with a subordinate employee and got her pregnant while she was married to someone else. Derek's face flushed with anger, and he said that Claire wasn't technically a subordinate employee when their relationship started because she hadn't been hired yet, and that he'd made sure the hiring process was handled by other people on his team so there wouldn't be any appearance of favoritism or bias in the decision. Rachel laughed out loud at Derek's attempt to parse the ethics violation on a technicality, and she told him that the fact that he'd thought carefully about how to structure the hiring process to avoid obvious red flags actually made the situation worse because it showed he'd known his relationship with Claire was inappropriate and had taken deliberate steps to hide it rather than disclosing it properly to his company's leadership team. Derek started to respond but then seemed to think better of it, and instead he just turned and walked out of the community center without saying anything else, leaving his car in the parking lot and presumably calling for a rideshare to take him home since his wife had already left without him. Rachel and I followed Derek out of the building a few minutes later, after I'd confirmed with Margaret that she had all the documentation she needed for her incident report, and that there wouldn't be any issues with the community center trying to hold me responsible for the disruption to their scheduled event. Margaret assured me that she understood I'd done what I felt was necessary given the circumstances, and that she didn't blame me for Claire's decision to use her facility as the venue for a celebration that was based on fraudulent information, and she said she would make sure the incident report clearly stated that the exposure of the fraud had been justified and necessary to prevent further deception of the guests who had attended in good faith. Rachel drove me back to her apartment where I'd arranged to stay for at least the next few days while I figured out what to do about the apartment I'd been sharing with Claire and whether I wanted to try to force Claire to move out immediately or whether it made more sense to just find a new place for myself and let her keep the apartment if she could afford it on her own. Rachel made coffee, and we sat at her kitchen table going through all the documentation I'd prepared and making sure everything was organized properly for the divorce proceedings that would officially begin as soon as Claire signed the separation agreement or failed to sign it within the time frame specified in the document. Rachel said that based on her experience working at a family law firm, she thought the divorce would be relatively straightforward, given the clear evidence of adultery and paternity fraud, and that most judges would be extremely unsympathetic to any attempts by Claire to claim she deserved spousal support or a larger share of our joint assets after what she'd done. Rachel also pointed out that the fact that I'd documented everything so carefully and had presented the evidence in a public forum with multiple witnesses would make it very difficult for Claire to later claim that I'd fabricated any of the proof or that the affair hadn't actually happened, and that the presence of Derek's wife at the baby shower when the evidence was revealed meant that she could potentially be called as a witness if there were any disputes about the facts during the divorce proceedings. So I asked Rachel what she thought would happen with Derek's job and whether the ethics investigation would actually result in any meaningful consequences for him. And Rachel said that depended a lot on how Vertex Solutions wanted to handle the situation and whether they decided it was better to quietly let Derek resign or whether they wanted to make an example of him by terminating him for cause and publicizing the ethics violation as a way of demonstrating their commitment to maintaining appropriate workplace boundaries. Rachel said that either way, Derek's reputation in the local business community was probably severely damaged, and he would likely have a hard time finding another executive-level position at a comparable company given that word of the scandal would spread quickly through professional networks, and board members who might have considered hiring him would now see him as a liability. I spent the rest of that evening responding to text messages from people who had been at the baby shower and wanted to either express their support for how I'd handled the situation or criticize me for choosing such a public and dramatic way to expose Claire's affair. And I noticed that the responses tended to break down along predictable lines with people who had primarily been my friends or colleagues expressing understanding and support, while people who had primarily been Claire's friends expressing outrage and accusing me of cruelty and vindictiveness. I responded politely to the supportive messages and ignored the critical ones because I didn't see any point in trying to justify my choices to people who had already decided I was the villain in the situation, regardless of what evidence I presented. One message that did catch my attention came from a woman named Jennifer, who identified herself as a colleague of Claire's at her current marketing firm. And Jennifer said she wanted me to know that there had been rumors at the office for months about Claire having an inappropriate relationship with someone in a position of power at another company, and that several people had noticed Claire's behavior had changed dramatically starting around the time she'd begun interviewing for the position at Vertex Solutions. Jennifer said she'd never felt comfortable confronting Claire directly about the rumors because they'd never been close friends, and she didn't want to create workplace drama, but she'd always felt guilty about not saying something to someone who might have been able to intervene before the situation got as far as it did. I thanked Jennifer for reaching out and told her that I appreciated her willingness to share what she'd observed, and I asked her if she would be willing to provide a written statement about the timeline of Claire's behavior changes and the rumors that had been circulating at her workplace, because that information might be useful during divorce proceedings if Claire tried to claim that the affair had been brief or that she'd only recently become involved with Derek. Jennifer said she would think about it and talk to an attorney about whether providing such a statement might create any problems for her professionally, but that she wanted to help if she could, because she thought what Claire had done was unconscionable and she didn't want to see me get taken advantage of in divorce court. The week following the baby shower was a blur of logistical arrangements and difficult conversations as I worked with Rachel to finalize the separation agreement and begin the formal divorce proceedings while also dealing with the practical reality of extracting myself from a shared living situation with someone who had betrayed me so completely. Claire had sent several text messages in the days immediately after the shower, alternating between angry accusations that I'd destroyed her life and tearful apologies where she claimed she'd made terrible mistakes but still loved me and wanted a chance to explain everything properly. But I didn't respond to any of these messages because Rachel had advised me that any communication with Claire at this point should go through attorneys to avoid creating situations where things I said could be taken out of context or used against me later. On Thursday morning, I received a call from Margaret at the community center telling me that she'd been contacted by a reporter from the local business journal who had heard about the baby shower incident and wanted to write a story about Derek's ethics violation and his placement on administrative leave from Vertex Solutions. And Margaret wanted to know whether I had any objection to her confirming the basic facts of what had happened at the event. I told Margaret that I had no objection to her telling the truth about what had occurred, and that I thought the story should be reported accurately so that people understood the full context of Derek's professional misconduct, and Margaret said she would provide the reporter with a factual account that focused on the documented evidence rather than on the personal drama or emotional aspects of the situation. The article appeared online the following Monday with a headline about a prominent tech executive being placed on leave pending an ethics investigation related to an undisclosed romantic relationship with a newly hired employee. And while the article didn't mention my name or provide detailed information about the baby shower confrontation, it did include enough specifics about the timeline and the nature of the relationship that anyone who knew Derek or Claire personally would immediately understand what had happened. The article also noted that Derek's wife had filed for legal separation within days of learning about the affair, which suggested she'd moved quickly to protect herself financially and legally from whatever consequences Derek's actions might bring. I received a notification later that same week that Claire had finally signed the separation agreement after consulting with an attorney who had apparently advised her that fighting the terms would be expensive and unlikely to result in a better outcome given the strength of the evidence against her, and the agreement included provisions for dividing our limited shared assets and terminating our joint bank accounts and confirming that I would have no legal or financial responsibility for the child Claire was carrying. Rachel told me that Claire's attorney had tried to negotiate for a small amount of temporary spousal support to help Claire transition to living on her own, but Rachel had firmly rejected that request and had pointed out that Claire's affair with her future employer meant she'd been planning her financial independence for months and didn't need support from the husband she'd been planning to leave. The final piece of news that brought a sense of closure to the entire situation came about 3 weeks after the baby shower when I learned through Jennifer, Claire's former colleague who had reached out to me, that Vertex Solutions had completed their ethics investigation and had accepted Derek's resignation rather than terminating him for cause, which meant he would receive a severance package but would also be leaving the company immediately with the understanding that his employment had ended due to violations of workplace relationship disclosure policies. Jennifer also told me that Claire's job offer had been formally rescinded by Vertex Solutions' Human Resources Department, with a letter explaining that the offer had been contingent on accurate disclosure of any conflicts of interest or personal relationships that might affect her work, and that Claire's failure to disclose her romantic relationship with the chief operating officer constituted a material misrepresentation that voided the employment agreement before it had even begun. I spent a quiet evening after receiving this news sitting in Rachel's apartment and thinking about how drastically my life had changed in the span of just a few weeks from the morning I'd found that pregnancy test in the bathroom trash to this moment where my marriage was legally ending and both Claire and Derek were facing the professional and personal consequences of their choices. I felt a complicated mixture of satisfaction that justice had been served and sadness that the relationship I'd invested 7 years of my life in had ended in such a spectacular betrayal. But mostly I felt relief that I'd discovered the truth before it was too late and before I'd spent years raising a child that wasn't mine while Claire and Derek continued their deception. Rachel came home from work that evening and found me sitting on her couch staring at nothing in particular, and she sat down next to me and asked how I was feeling now that everything was basically resolved and I could start thinking about moving forward with my life. I told her honestly that I didn't know how I felt yet because I was still processing everything that had happened, but that I was grateful I'd had the training and temperament to handle the situation methodically rather than letting my emotions take over and doing something I would have regretted later.